You have probably heard it without realizing what it was. One moment your yard is full of sound. The robins are moving through the grass. A chickadee is working the feeder. Somewhere in the back of the yard, a house sparrow is doing what house sparrows do, which is make noise constantly and without apparent purpose. The whole space is alive with small overlapping sounds that you have heard so many times you stopped noticing them years ago. And then, nothing. Not less sound. Not quieter. Nothing. Complete silence, arriving so suddenly that it registers in your body before your brain has processed what changed. You look up. You look around. The yard looks exactly the same. The feeder is still there. The bushes are still there. Nothing is visibly different, but every single bird has stopped. If you have experienced this, you already know the feeling it produces. Something between unease and attention. The specific quality of stillness that your nervous system reads as wrong before you can explain why. You are standing in your own backyard in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, and something has made every living thing around you go silent at the same time. Most people look around for a few seconds, find nothing, and go back to what they were doing. Tonight I want to tell you what you were actually standing inside when that happened. Because the silence in your yard is not an absence of information. It is an enormous amount of information, transmitted in a fraction of a second, through a communication system that has been operating in the spaces around human beings for millions of years. The birds did not stop because nothing was happening. They stopped because something was. Stay until the end, because what we cover in the final section will change the way you read the silence around you for the rest of your life. And once you understand it, you will never hear your yard go quiet the same way again. The first thing to understand is that bird sound is not random. This seems obvious when you say it out loud. But most people treat the ambient sound of birds in a yard the same way they treat background music in a store, as something happening in the environment that does not carry specific information. It is pleasant or unpleasant, loud or quiet, present or absent. This is not what bird sound is. Bird vocalizations are a communication system. A complex, layered, constantly updated communication system that encodes specific information about the environment, the identity and location of other birds, the presence and type of threats, the availability of food, territorial boundaries, social relationships, and dozens of other variables that researchers are still working to fully catalog. When birds in your yard are making sound, they are not simply expressing contentment. They are talking. They are reporting. They are maintaining a continuous real-time picture of what is happening in the shared environment. And when they all stop at once, that is also communication. The technical term researchers use is acoustic monitoring. Birds are continuously listening to the soundscape around them and updating their behavior based on what they hear. The presence of bird sound tells every bird in the area that the birds around them have assessed the environment as safe enough to vocalize. The absence of bird sound tells every bird in the area that something has changed. One bird detecting a threat and going silent creates a signal. Every bird within hearing distance of that signal responds to it. They go silent too. And because they go silent, every bird within hearing distance of them goes silent. The silence propagates outward through the bird population in your area in a wave, much faster than any individual bird could physically move, carrying the information that something has changed and that every bird in the network should stop what it is doing and assess. What you experienced standing in your yard was not the absence of activity. You were standing inside a wave of alarm information moving through a biological communication network at the speed of sound. Now let me explain what actually triggers this response, because this is where it gets specific. The most common trigger for a complete yard silence is the presence of a predator. Specifically, a predator that birds classify as an aerial threat. Hawks are the clearest example. The Cooper's hawk, the sharp-shinned hawk, the red-tailed hawk. These are the predators that specialize in hunting small birds. And birds have evolved alarm responses specifically calibrated to these threats in ways that are extraordinarily precise. Research by ornithologist Christopher Templeton at the University of Washington documented something remarkable about the alarm calls of black-capped chickadees. The chickadee produces a specific alarm call, the familiar chickadee call, but the number of D notes at the end of the call is not random. It encodes information about the threat level. Small, agile predators that are difficult to escape produce calls with more D notes. Large, slow predators that are easier to avoid produce calls with fewer. Other birds in the area respond differently depending on the structure of the call they hear. The chickadee is not just producing an alarm. It is producing a graded alarm that tells nearby birds something specific about the nature and severity of the threat. But the response to an aerial predator is different from the response to a ground predator, and this distinction is directly relevant to what you experienced. When a hawk appears over a yard, birds do not produce loud alarm calls. Loud alarm calls would identify the location of the calling bird to the predator. Instead, birds go silent. They freeze. They press themselves against branches or drop into vegetation. They remove themselves as acoustic targets by removing themselves from the acoustic environment entirely. The silence is the alarm. When every bird in your yard goes silent simultaneously, the most probable explanation is that a hawk or other aerial predator has entered the airspace above your property or has been detected in the immediate vicinity. The silence is not a response to nothing. It is a coordinated, instantaneous collective decision by every bird in the area to remove themselves from an acoustic environment that has become dangerous. And here is the detail that most people never know. The hawk may have been there for only seconds before it moved on. Birds can detect a hawk at distances that exceed what human vision can resolve, particularly when the hawk is high and moving against a bright sky. By the time you looked up and saw nothing, the hawk may have already passed. The silence that remained for another 30 seconds or minute afterward was the birds maintaining their freeze response while they waited to confirm the threat had passed. You were standing in the aftermath of a predator pass that your own visual system missed entirely. The birds caught it. Now there are other triggers for yard silence, and not all of them involve predators. Weather is one of the most powerful forces affecting bird vocal behavior, and the changes that precede severe weather can produce silences that are distinctly different in character from predator silences, even if they feel similar to a human observer. Before a significant thunderstorm, particularly a storm system that produces large pressure changes as it approaches, bird activity undergoes a specific and documented pattern of change. Birds become more active and vocal in the period before the pressure drop arrives, often dramatically so, as though the impending change in conditions creates urgency. Then, as the pressure actually begins to drop and the storm front moves closer, activity decreases sharply. Birds move to shelter. Vocalization drops. The yard goes quiet in a way that feels different from the brief freeze of a predator response, more settled, more sustained, as if the birds have made a decision about where they are going to be for the next several hours. Researchers studying avian barometric sensitivity have documented that many bird species can detect pressure changes that are too subtle for humans to feel. Their middle ear contains a structure called the vitale organ that functions as a highly sensitive barometric detector. In some species, birds have been observed altering their behavior hours before weather changes that human instruments would not flag as significant until much later. When your yard goes silent and the silence persists for more than a few minutes and the sky has that particular quality of stillness that comes before a significant storm, the birds may be responding to pressure information that your body is not equipped to detect. They knew the storm was coming before you did. There is a third category of silence that is less understood and more unsettling, and I want to spend some time on it, because it is the one that people describe with the most unease. Sometimes the yard goes silent at a moment when there is no visible predator, no approaching weather, no obvious external cause of any kind. The silence arrives in the middle of an ordinary calm afternoon and has none of the specific characteristics of a hawk freeze or a storm response. It simply happens, and it lasts longer than it should. And then, eventually, the birds come back. Researchers who study landscape ecology have proposed several explanations for this phenomenon that are worth understanding. One involves infrasound, which is low-frequency sound below the range of human hearing, below 20 hertz. Infrasound travels long distances and passes through solid objects easily. It is produced by earthquakes, by large storm systems hundreds of miles away, by ocean waves, by certain industrial processes, and by events that involve rapid large-scale movement of air or earth. Birds are sensitive to infrasound in ways that humans are not. Research following the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake documented that birds in coastal areas moved to higher ground hours before the tsunami arrived, responding to infrasound produced by the seismic event that was inaudible to human ears but clearly detectable by the birds. When your yard goes silent without an obvious cause, one possibility that cannot be ruled out is that the birds are responding to infrasound from a source you cannot detect. A distant seismic event, a severe weather system hundreds of miles away, a low-frequency disturbance in the environment that has not yet manifested in any form your sensory system can access. The birds are not responding to nothing. They are responding to something in a frequency range you were never built to receive. There is something else worth understanding about what happens to the yard when the birds return after a silence. The return is not random. It follows a specific sequence that reflects the social structure of bird communities and the information sharing function that bird sound performs. The first birds to resume calling after a silence are typically not the most vulnerable species. They are often the species that have the most information about the environment and the most to gain from broadcasting that information, the ones whose calling signals to every other bird in the area that the threat assessment has changed and that conditions have returned to safe. In many North American yards, this means the first bird you hear after a silence is often a crow, or a blue jay, or another species with sophisticated threat detection capabilities and a social role in information distribution. The crow that calls first after a long silence is not simply singing. It is issuing an all-clear signal. It is telling every bird within hearing range that it has assessed the environment and found it safe to vocalize again. And the wave of returning sound that follows, the gradual reemergence of the robin, the chickadee, the sparrow, is each of those species making an individual decision to trust the information being broadcast by the bird that called first. You are watching, in those moments when the yard comes back to life, a real-time demonstration of distributed trust and information sharing across a community of different species that have learned to use each other's assessments of the environment. The crow vouches for the safety of the yard. The chickadee hears the crow and makes a calculation, and the sparrow, hearing the chickadee, follows. Now, I want to tell you something about what all of this means for how you experience the space around your house. You live inside a biological surveillance network that has been operating continuously for millions of years. The birds in your yard are monitoring the environment at frequencies and distances and levels of sensitivity that your own nervous system cannot access. They are detecting aerial predators before your eyes can find them. They are reading pressure changes that precede weather you will not feel for hours. They are responding to low-frequency signals from events that may be occurring far outside the range of anything you can perceive. And they are reporting all of it, continuously, through a communication system that you can hear but have never been taught to read. The silence is the most legible part of that system. When your yard goes silent, something has been detected. Something that every bird in the area has assessed as significant enough to trigger a coordinated collective freeze response. The information content of that silence is enormous. The birds have already processed it, made decisions based on it, and adjusted their behavior accordingly. You are simply the last one in the yard to know. The next time you are outside and the birds go silent, do not look for whatever made it happen. By the time you notice the silence, the cause may already be gone. Instead, pay attention to the silence itself. How sudden was it? A true predator response arrives in a fraction of a second, so fast that it feels like a switch being thrown. How sustained is it? A hawk freeze typically lasts between 30 seconds and 2 minutes before the birds begin testing the environment with cautious calls. A weather response can last much longer, building into sustained reduced activity for hours. Which bird calls first when the sound returns? The species that speaks first after a silence is the most confident assessor of safety in your yard. If you watch over time, you will notice it is usually the same species, possibly the same individual bird, that issues the all clear. And notice what you feel in your own body during the silence. Because the unease you experience is not irrational. It is not anxiety or imagination. It is a vestigial response from a time in human evolutionary history when the silence of every bird in the area meant the same thing it means to the birds. Something is here that should concern you. Your nervous system still knows how to read that signal. You have just spent years learning to ignore it. Tell me in the comments, Have you experienced a silence like the one we described today? A moment when everything stopped at once and something in you registered it as wrong before you understood why? Tell me what happened after. Whether the hawk appeared, whether the storm came, whether the silence resolved quickly or lasted. Your account matters. And the person reading these comments right now who has never had anyone explain what they were actually standing inside when their yard went silent, that person is here. Your story is exactly what they need to hear. I will see you in the next one.